Welcome, everyone, to the March Lunchtime Lecture. I'm Chuck Harris, Executive Director of the Texas X's. Thank you so much for joining us and for staying engaged with the 40 Acres from wherever you are. Our lesson today about the Great Depression is from Dr. Rachel Ozanne, a lecturer in the Department of History at UT Austin. It's got an intriguing title that I'm sure I'll understand once this is all over. Biscuits, the Dole, and Nodding Donkeys, Texas Politics, 1929 to 1932. Dr. Ozanne came to UT in 2002 and received her BA in Plan 2 and History in 2006. She entered the History Graduate Program in 2007. In recent years, she has written about religious history and experience in digital and print media for the Appendix, Religion Dispatches, and the Not Even Past. Her essay, Becoming Lost, was published in an anthology called Empty the Pews with Epiphany Press in December 2019. She's also composing a book manuscript that combines her interest in religious studies with personal memoir and beginning a new research project on the religious history of Texas. In addition to her work as a lecturer at UT Austin, she works as a freelance writer and editor. Please welcome Dr. Ozanne. Professor, take it away.
Well, good morning, or I should say good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me here to join you with the Texas X's. I am Dr. Ozanne, and I'm looking forward to talking to you about Biscuits, the Dole, and Nodding Donkeys. We'll be thinking a lot about Texas politics and economic history in the 1920s and 30s. Just to give you an overview of what I'll be talking about today, what I'm basing this talk on is a book that I edited for UT Press with the same title as this lecture, Biscuits, the Dole, and Nodding Donkeys. So I'll give it a little background on my involvement in the project. Then I'll give kind of an overview of some of the major themes of Texas history in the 20s and 30s, and then tell some stories from the book. So in terms of my involvement with this book editing process, the book, just to say, came out in late 2019 with the UT Press. I was recruited by the history department here at UT, with whom I have a very long relationship at this point in my life, to help edit and write an introduction to a book manuscript that was left behind by the late Professor Norman D. Brown. Norman Brown is a well-regarded scholar of Texas history. He passed away a few years ago and left behind this book manuscript, which I edited, which was the sequel to a book he wrote on Texas politics in the 1920s called Hood, Bonnet, and Little Brown Jug. So when I was editing the book, the manuscript didn't have a title, and I wanted to come up with a title that would feel familiar to readers of Norman's first book. So I picked Biscuits, the Dole, and Nodding Donkeys to talk about the three major political issues facing Texans in the early years of the Great Depression in the 1930s. So I'll be getting to all of those themes before the talk is over, but just to give you a little background on why I'm giving this talk and where a lot of the source material comes from. I also sometimes teach Texas history to undergrads here at UT. So this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart for a number of reasons. I'd like to start by talking about some of the trends in political history and at the national level and the state level in Texas in the 1920s and on into the 30s. So just to give you a little bit of a refresher, if it's been a while since you've thought about US political history, now about 100 years ago, when we're thinking about the 1920s, the start of the 1920s, the United States was on the heels of World War I, on the heels of the big progressive movement of the early 20th century, and many Americans had gotten worn out on progressivism. They were tired of the war, and they were tired of some of the progressive war efforts made by the Woodrow Wilson administration. So a lot of voters were compelled by the message of the National Republican Party in the 1920s. Warren G. Harding ran on a platform promising a return to normalcy and promising that big business would be once again the leaders in American society. And I've noted here for you along the bottom that Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover were all Republican presidents basically from the 1920s to the beginning of the Great Depression. So nationally speaking, Republicans were back in power. Within the National Democratic Party, there was a bit of a sense of conflicted identity, a kind of a push-pull of which way the party would go. In the 20s, these were the three major candidates for president, none of whom were elected: James Cox, John Davis, and Al Smith. And we can see Cox in 1920 ran on a Woodrow Wilson style progressive platform. Davis was kind of a compromise candidate, trying to bring together the more progressive and the more conservative wings of the Democratic Party. And then Al Smith was a wet, meaning that he was opposed to Prohibition, a Roman Catholic who promoted urban reform, and came from the New York City Tammany Hall machine. So lots of conflict within the Democratic Party about what their identity was going to be. So Texas had to figure out where it fit within this national story. Broadly speaking, Texas was under one-party rule for most of the 20th century, and it was mostly dominated by Democrats. This particular chart that I found online doesn't show the long history. It shows 1964 versus 2012, but it gives you an idea of the ways that the Democratic Party really dominated the state. And most of the politicians talking about in this lecture were Democrats. The Republican Party in the 1920s and 30s in the state of Texas was small. It was not particularly powerful. In the late 19th century, the Texas Republican Party had been dominated by African American leadership, but white members of the Republican Party did everything they could to push African Americans out of the Republican Party in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And so there were some small political gains for the Texas Republican Party in the 20s and 30s, but for the most part, it remained in the background. And the Texas Democratic Party really dominated the scene. So when we're thinking then about Texas politics in the 20s and 30s, we're talking mostly about fights that were going on within the Democratic Party. And much like the National Democratic Party, where there was this tension between various wings of the party and who was going to dominate, this Democratic Party in the state of Texas also saw a lot of conflict over what its core identity or core values were going to be. One part of the Democratic Party in the state of Texas was dominated by the ideas of business progressivism. I usually say this to my undergrad students, so I'll say it to all of you, just not wanting to assume. The progressivism of the early 20th century is not the same definition that we would call someone progressive today. And when we think about progressivism in the southern United States in this part of the 20th century, it's perhaps even farther removed from what we might think of as a progressive political agenda today. So some things that would have been considered progressive in terms of political ideas or ideologies in the 1920s, especially in the South, reinforcement of prohibition. So most politicians who supported other types of progressive reforms supported prohibition. In the South, this also often meant anti-evolutionary ideas and trying to oppose the teaching of evolution in schools. And then even efforts to try to enforce social morality. And some of this even came through the Ku Klux Klan, which I'll talk about a bit later in the presentation. In the time period that I'll be discussing, the 20s and 30s, governors that represented this progressive trend were Dan Moody and Governor Pat Neff, who both supported business progressivism. Of course, business progressivism also included things that we might associate with a more contemporary progressive agenda, things like improving public roads, improving public schools, tax reform, providing better health services to the people in the state of Texas. But importantly, progressivism did not mean things like improving relationships between capital and labor. It did not mean protecting historically marginalized people in the state of Texas, African Americans or Mexican Americans, for example. Women who were eligible voters by this period in time in the state of Texas were often proponents of some of these reform measures in education, roads, etc. But by and large, there weren't too many female office holders in the state of Texas in this era. Women tended to work more behind the scenes as lobbyists, and a few did receive some state-appointed positions of power. So now I'm just going to kind of talk about some of the various political issues in the state of Texas in this era. lots of kind of colorful and exciting stories from this era, as well as things that cause us to pause and reflect upon another time in our history in the state. One key political issue in Texas history in this time was Prohibition. Prohibition had become the law of the land during World War I. It was something that many progressive reformers, not only in the state of Texas, but in the United States as a whole, had been really working toward for decades. And they were able to get it passed as a wartime measure, both with the idea of conserving resources so that grains would be used to feed the troops, as well as protecting troop morality. Almost as soon as the ink was dry on that amendment, people were fighting about whether it should actually continue to exist. And within the Democratic Party nationally, as well as in particular the state of Texas, this was a major source of friction. And you would see people line up on either side of this conflict known as wets or dries. Wets being people who supported ending prohibition and making the sale of alcohol legal again. Dries, people who wanted to maintain prohibition. Texas, like many other parts of the country, was subject to a crime wave during the era of prohibition. And just to give you one anecdote, one story to talk about the ways that the prohibition era affected the state of Texas, I like to talk about the birth of the city of Borger. So Borger is a panhandle town in the state of Texas. Oil was discovered in that area, and people flocked westward to try to get in on producing oil in this area. And a town was very quickly founded by a man with the last name Borger, Ace Borger. Wildcatters, people who wanted to put up their own kind of one-man oil. My brain is only thinking of the word harvesting for some reason. That's not the drilling. There we go. Anyway, oil drilling, one man, trying to get in and get while the getting was good before the big oil companies came in, flocked to Borger, and pretty quickly the town grew in size and was being run by a crime syndicate led by the mayor of the town's very shady associate, a man named Two Gun Dick Herwig, who you can see pictured here on the slide. Governor Moody found out about all the corruption that was going on in the town of Borger at the time, and he sent one of the Texas Rangers, a pretty famous ranger from this era, Frank Hamer, to investigate. After Hamer left, the crime syndicate was up and running again. In the course of these events, the district attorney in the area, John Holmes, was murdered. In September of 1929, Governor Moody decided to institute martial law, and eventually the city came under lawful control, but not before Ace Borger himself was shot to death. So this type of prohibition, secret sales of alcohol, crime syndicates, it happened in a lot of other places in the state of Texas, not just in Borger, but it's a pretty good example of the ways that prohibition and oil production could kind of go in hand to create crime-filled areas. This particular town, one resident wrote a poem about this town, which I always thought was pretty entertaining. Let's sing a song of Borger, famed for its graft and rot. It's just a wide place in the wood, this town that God forgot. For this village large boasts deeper sin than Sodom ever knew. Come lend an ear, kind stranger, and I'll whisper them to you. So apparently things were pretty bad in Borger. Of course, race and racial conflict continued to be an issue in the state of Texas. This was the era of Jim Crow, in which African Americans throughout the country, and in particularly in southern states, saw their rights and freedoms restricted. This was the era of separate but equal. And in the state of Texas in the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan had a pretty rapid rise and fall, and in a brief window of time was very influential politically. The KKK had briefly existed in the 19th century as a Reconstruction era white supremacist group. And then it was reborn in the early 20th century. It's a little bit of a complicated story of its origins, but there was a man who wrote a series of novels, one called The Klansman. This man was Thomas Dixon, and he wrote this sort of romanticized history of the South, long lost South, being protected by a heroic Klansman. These books were turned into theater plays that traveled around the country and became very popular, sometimes even causing race riots. One particularly famous race riot in the city of Atlanta in 1906. And eventually this source material was taken up to be made as a film. The film became known as The Birth of a Nation. I've not personally seen this film from start to finish. It's one of those pieces of cinema that has a very complex history because it's known for being one of the kind of early excellent examples of cinematography and film. It also has incredibly racist subject matter. People who saw this film and liked its ideas decided to found the KKK again. And a group met outside the city of Atlanta in 1915 to refound the Klan. And their motto was, as I put here on the slide, Native White Protestant Supremacy. The KKK in this era did target African Americans, but also targeted people who were Jewish or Catholic, other immigrants, basically people who did not fit into their image of what an American was supposed to be. They had really large numbers in places like Indiana, Oregon, and Oklahoma, but also had a pretty strong presence in the state of Texas. The Texas Klan was officially founded in 1920, and in the early 20s was tolerated by some Texas politicians within the Democratic Party who thought that most Klan members were just kind of misguided but generally okay people. Some politicians even thought that the vigilante tactics the Klan used were helpful in the state. Some politicians supported them outright in the state of Texas. U.S. Senator from Texas Earl B. Mayfield ran openly as a member of the Klan and was elected in 1922. So by 1922, 1923, the Klan reached its peak membership in the state of Texas, about 150,000 people, but its popularity dropped off pretty quickly. By 1928, there were only about 2,500 members. And the reasons for that are complicated, but at least two important politicians stood out against the Klan. One was Miriam Ferguson, more commonly called Ma Ferguson. And while she did not represent the business progressive wing of the Democratic Party, she was strongly anti-Klan and ran for governor in 1924 on an anti-Klan platform. Dan Moody, who would later become governor, became famous as a young attorney in the state of Texas. He put some members of the Klan on trial in the city of Georgetown, just up the road from us here in Austin. Moody was an up-and-coming lawyer, and he prosecuted 3 men who flogged and tarred a traveling salesman who wouldn't leave town when these men in Georgetown asked him to. Moody was able to secure a conviction for one of the men and confessions from the other 2, which made him so popular that he was elected Attorney General of the state of Texas in 1924, and then governor for 2 successive terms in 26 and 28. So the Klan had this kind of epic rise and fall, but it gives us some insights into the ways that for some Texans, white Texans in particular in this era, issues of nativism, race, and ethnicity were central to their understanding of politics and who gets to participate. As I've already said, this was the era of Jim Crow, and there were plenty examples from this era in which African Americans suffered at the hands of white people in the state of Texas. One example that Norman Brown talks about in his book is the example of George Hughes. George Hughes was a transient Black man. He was traveling through the city of Sherman and was accused of rape by a white woman. Hughes just pleaded guilty, and a mob of white people in the town of Sherman wanted to exact their own mob rule justice. The Rangers and the local police tried to protect George Hughes in the local courthouse from the anger and the fury of the mob. And so the decision was made by the mob to set fire to the building. And I'll just say that content warning very briefly, Hughes was left inside where he burned to death in the building. Governor Moody was forced to declare martial law for a second time to get the situation in Sherman under control. I will just add that it was very common for black men who were lynched in this time period and in previous time periods to be accused of rape. Most often this was not the case, that they had actually raped someone, but it was a common reason given for this kind of public mistreatment, abuse, and ultimately murder. The era of Jim Crow also affected Mexican Americans in the state of Texas in slightly different ways. Most of the Jim Crow laws in the state of Texas weren't specifically geared toward Mexican Americans the way that they were toward African Americans, but segregation nevertheless affected Mexican Americans in a variety of ways. Mexican Americans could be discriminated against in public settings the way that the sign on the slide indicates. And it was in the late 1920s that LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, was born. And one of LULAC's first efforts to try to provide greater equity and equality for their families and their children was a court case, Salvatierra Independent School District versus Salvatierra, where LULAC was trying to argue against segregated classrooms. Ultimately, the judge in this particular court found that segregated classrooms in this instance were appropriate because of language differences. And at this point, the Great Depression was beginning, and LULAC didn't have enough money at that point in time to continue to pursue this case further. On a little bit lighter note, one of the important political developments of the 20s and 30s in the state of Texas, and I realized I imported this slide from another presentation and I put the wrong heading above this slide, so I apologize for that. We're still talking about politics in 20s and 30s. 1936 was the year of the Texas Centennial, celebrating Texas's independence from Mexico. A Centennial Commission was created in 1932 and was seen to fruition under the governorship of Jimmy Allred. Various cities bid for the opportunity to host the Centennial, but the city of Dallas won that honor and constructed lots of important buildings and sites that are still in use in Dallas in that time. This was also an era in which Texans, both at the professional and I guess non-professional level, were trying to rewrite and retell the story of Texas with less of an emphasis on its kind of Confederate past and more of an emphasis on things like the Texas Revolution, trying to change the narrative about where Texas really fit into both its own story and US history more broadly. And so one of the examples of that in this Centennial celebration was a performance known as the Cavalcade of Texas, which was this giant pageant that was put on to present this new narrative of Texas history. State leaders, local businessmen, local leaders took the work of historians and artists to create this performance. I'll also just note that African Americans in the city of Dallas worked very hard to have their own history represented at this Centennial celebration. And there was a exhibit hall set aside specifically to highlight the history of African Americans in the state of Texas. So we can see African Americans advocating for themselves despite many of the challenges that they faced under Jim Crow in this era. So one thing to say when we're thinking about Texas in the 20s and 30s is that the rise of the Great Depression did see some continuities from the 20s into the 30s, but also some discontinuities moving from the 20s into the 30s. So what we'll see is that a lot of the things that were features of the 20s, politics in the state of Texas was very much dominated by people with important personalities, Miriam Ferguson and her husband Jim, Governor Moody, even to an extent. So this kind of personality dominance of politics would continue into the 30s. The importance of oil and prohibition would continue into the early 30s. But there were things that Texans would have to reconsider moving into the Great Depression. By and large, Texans had often been kind of wary of accepting federal support, and many Texans were at least briefly willing to reconsider that during the Great Depression. There would be oil discovered in new places. We'll talk about some of that, as well as a crisis in the cotton market. But one very important discontinuity to note is that Texans, who historically voted almost exclusively for Democratic candidates for president, in 1928 were persuaded to vote for the Republican candidate, Herbert Hoover. It's a little bit complicated, but some of why Texans were willing to support Hoover is that he seemed to be willing to allow Texans to continue to have their kind of state-run approach to things. Also, many Texans despised Al Smith, who I mentioned before was this Roman Catholic, wet, Tammany Hall, New York City guy. So in 1928, Texas flipped and voted for the Republican candidate. I do sometimes get questions from students if, this 28 election is the beginning of Texas becoming a Republican-dominated state, and I'll just say no. Although Texans would occasionally vote for Republican candidates, Eisenhower being one of them that comes to mind immediately. For the most part, Texans would continue to vote for Democratic presidents up until the late 20th century. So that transition takes a long time and doesn't really happen until later in the 20th century. So before I provide some time for questions, I did want to tell a few stories from Norman Brown's book, Biscuits, the Dole, and Nodding Donkeys, and to kind of talk about some of these continuities and discontinuities that I was just mentioning when we think about the history of Texas in this time period. So one theme that I highlighted in the title of the book was the idea of populism, and I took the word biscuits, referring to the role that populism played in Texas politics in this era, from a quote from Jim Ferguson, also known as Pa Ferguson. And I'll just read the quote to you because I think it's pretty colorful, and Jim Ferguson is Jim Ferguson. And he said, "There are now only two ways in which a man can make himself governor. One is to convince people that he will give them something they want, and the other is to convince them that he will relieve them of something they don't want. You might call it giving the people a biscuit. As long as the biscuits last, they are for you. But when you cease to deliver the biscuits, they will not be for you any longer." The backstory on Jim Ferguson is that he had been governor of the state of Texas in the 1910s and was impeached and convicted, but he chose to retire before the conviction could officially be applied. But he was prevented from ever running for a state office in Texas ever again as a result of these impeachment proceedings. In the 20s and then again in the 30s, he promoted his wife's bid for governor. And Miriam Ferguson served 2 non-consecutive terms as governor in the mid-20s and in the early 30s. So a lot of people talked about the ways that Jim Ferguson was kind of the man behind the scenes. And when Miriam Ferguson ran for governor, both times that she ran saying that if you elected her, you'd be getting 2 governors for the price of 1. The Fergusons really did not represent this business progressive wing in the Texas Democratic Party. When I'm talking about them being populists, they tended to appeal especially to rural Texans, people that were not as interested in some of the reform projects that people in the urban centers in the state of Texas were trying to support. Jim Ferguson himself was in fact a banker and a lawyer, and technically could have been one of the elites, but he ran as a kind of folksy, of the people sort of person. He eventually created his own newspaper called the Ferguson Forum, where he put forward a lot of his views. Miriam, as I said, was elected governor once in 24 and again in 1932. And progressives kept thinking they had finally beaten the Fergusons and the Fergusons would no longer influence Texas politics. But in fact, Miriam came back in 32. She even ran another time for governor, although wasn't elected. And what we saw is that the Fergusons ended up passing on this populist mantle to another politician, W. Lee O'Daniel, also known as Pappy O'Daniel. O'Daniel had gotten his start in the public eye as a promoter for the Light Crust Flour Company, and to promote this flour company created a band called the Light Crust Doughboys, which, if I remember correctly, still exists to this day. Later, O'Daniel decided to found his own flour company with his own brand. Basically, O'Daniel didn't actually process any of the flour in his company. It just packaged the flour with his brand on it. He created his own band to promote his flour brand. And the band was known for this "Please Pass the Biscuits, Pappy." When Pappy ran for governor, he ran on the golden rule and not too many other specific things. He had said that he would only run for governor if a certain number of people wrote into his radio show to request it, and he claimed that he got that many people to support his bid. So we can see that even as the Fergusons were perhaps coming to the end of their political dominance in the 40s, they passed along this populist mantle, even the Biscuits themselves, to Pappy O'Daniel. When we think about Texas politics in the 30s in particular, one of the themes that I highlighted in Norman Brown's books was the Dole. And I meant this to refer, broadly speaking, to the fact that some Texans were beginning to be open to the ideas of the New Deal. As I said previously, many Texans were kind of allergic to the ideas of government intervention, state intervention, but the Great Depression affected Texas deeply. Texans very quickly saw that the fact that they were far away from Wall Street and the fact that they had oil and cotton was not going to protect them from the Great Depression. And things became so desperate that they were willing to consider state intervention and even federal intervention into the state economy in ways that would have been unthinkable even just a few years before. One story that Dr. Brown talks about in his book is the ultimately failed efforts of leaders in the state of Texas as well as the state of Louisiana to try to get all of the major cotton producing states in the US South to declare a cotton holiday. And you can see this newspaper article title here on the slide. Huey Long thinks farmers should have a cotton holiday. Huey Long was a governor of Louisiana. He was a very colorful character. If you don't know about Huey Long, you should definitely look him up. He proposed a political idea called Share Our Wealth, in which he wanted every citizen in the United States to receive kind of an annual pension. Everyone should have a car and a house, and these are things the state should provide for them. Basically, there was so much fighting between the Texas legislature and Huey Long, kind of clash of personalities, that they could never agree on this cotton holiday. But the idea would have been that all of these cotton producing states would just take a year off from growing cotton, hold the cotton that they had in reserve as a way to try to artificially inflate prices on the global market. I'll also just note that a lot of politicians in this era ran promising to deliver an old age pension to Texans. This was never accomplished, but it was something that was promised during the Great Depression repeatedly. Texans in this era were also great supporters of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, at least in the early and mid 1930s. One of the most exciting stories in the book, Biscuits, Dole, and Nodding Donkeys, is this kind of behind the scenes role that the state of Texas ultimately played in helping Franklin Roosevelt to get the nomination for president in 1932. Basically, in 1932, FDR was one of many candidates trying to secure the Democratic Party's nomination for president, and he was running against a bunch of kind of regional favorite sons, William McAdoo in California, and Texans decided to support John Nance Garner, also known as Cactus Jack. Cactus Jack was actually pretty happy with his own situation. He had recently become Speaker of the House of Representatives, and that was a position he very much wanted. He didn't really want to run for president, but everyone in the state of Texas was kind of putting him forward as a way to try to have some control or sway over how the votes would go down at this nominating convention. Many Texans wanted to do anything they could to prevent Al Smith from getting the nomination another time. Texans were ultimately persuaded to provide all of their votes for Franklin Roosevelt only after John Garner was offered the role of vice president, which Garner, again, wasn't super jazzed about, but he decided to do anyway. At least according to the story in Dr. Brown's book, once Texas was throwing its support behind Franklin Roosevelt, California also decided to swing that way. Although Californians and Texans equally tried to take credit for who actually helped Roosevelt get the nomination. So we can see here Roosevelt, a progressive candidate in terms of his willingness to use state intervention, and Texans very much behind him in the 1930s. The last major theme of Dr. Brown's book is the theme of oil, which is, of course, a continuity from previous eras. The state of Texas's economy had been dominated by oil since the discovery of oil at Spindletop in 1901. In the 1930s, a new massive oil field was discovered in East Texas near the town of Kilgore in late 1930. What was great about Kilgore's oil field is that it was easy to get to. It was no more than 3,500 feet below the ground. And it turned out that it was just one giant lake of oil beneath the ground, not lots of little tiny pockets. 45 miles long and anywhere from 5 to 12 miles wide, covering over 1,400 acres of land. However, at first, people did not realize that this was one giant lake of oil under the ground. And as I mentioned, speaking about West Texas and the town of Borger, people flocked east. Wildcatters, small-time producers, and usual patterns of lawlessness and kind of oil boomtown ensued. In 1 month, the city of Kilgore grew from, or the town of Kilgore, I should say, grew from 700 to 10,000 people. So everybody was moving east. This discovery of oil happened during the governorship of Ross Sterling, who I haven't had much to say about so far, but he was kind of considered the business progressive successor to Dan Moody. Ross Sterling was mostly known for not wanting to express opinions of his own and not really knowing how to be a governor. He was a big oil tycoon before becoming governor. So not the most colorful personality, for sure. So once the reality of the situation, that this was just one giant lake of oil beneath the ground, was discovered, production took off even more. Texas was under what was known as the rule of capture. And the idea here was that you could take as much oil as you wanted, and whatever you took was yours. So it didn't matter where the oil had come from originally. If you captured it, it belonged to you. Small-time producers wanted to take advantage of this before the big oil companies could get in and elbow them out. But this led to massive overproduction and waste. Oil just spilling out to the ground, being totally useless. There was, at the time in Texas, already an ongoing court case about oil production in West Texas. And so in the 30s, oil in West Texas was being regulated with caps on production. Existing Texas law at the time allowed for regulation based on physical waste only, not on economic waste. This was indicative of the ways that Texans wanted to be sure that there was no such, creeping socialism, no economic regulation, the market rules all. So overproduction was not allowed to be capped if the intent behind it was to try to control prices. Larger producers actually wanted to implement similar production caps in this new East Texas oil field, but small-time producers claimed that this legislation actually had to do with price fixing and not physical waste. And they had a point there. I mean, this oil was being produced so quickly and waste was happening, so prices were dropping. So it wasn't really just about physical waste. And nobody in the state of Texas wanted to come out directly in favor of actual price fixing. Just that was not something that could be considered without kind of accusations of socialism and etc. Small-time producers thought that they would lose out, which was very likely if this legislation was put in place, and large producers and members of the government who supported them didn't want to be called socialists. So Governor Sterling eventually decided that production quotas were necessary, and they tried to get producers to go along with it voluntarily, but when that did not work, Governor Sterling instituted a martial law in East Texas to try to force compliance with production quotas. Crude oil prices did go up as a consequence, but also the production of hot oil increased. Hot oil meaning illegally produced oil. One man reportedly even built his house over top his oil well to prevent Railroad Commission employees from being able to access his records and see how much oil he was actually taking out of the ground. And then meanwhile, while all of that was going on, then Texas Attorney General James Allred decided to sue 17 large oil companies for violating Texas antitrust laws. So things were just totally out of hand. Martial law was eventually undone in Kilgore area when oil producers began filing injunctions with the federal district court in East Texas. Eventually, so many of them had successfully filed injunctions that martial law had to be revoked. After that, it was up to the Texas Railroad Commission to regulate matters. Things did get out of hand again for a while, but by 1934, the Texas state legislature passed a bill that allowed the state to kind of more definitively regulate oil production, and things kind of became a little bit more sensible moving into the 1940s. So those are some of the stories from Biscuits, the Dole, and Nodding Donkeys, as well as kind of an overview of Texas history, political and economic history in particular in this era. We can see some of these continuities of progressivism, but also discontinuities from moving from the 20s into the 30s. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm definitely happy to take questions at this point.
Thank you, Dr. Ozanne. This is Patricia Shampton with Texas Exes, and we do have a couple of questions that have been posted in the QA. Let's start with Ma Ferguson. So there was one question. Do you know if she had a religious affiliation?
I don't remember what it was off the top of my head, but yes, they would have presented themselves as Protestant Christians to be able to appeal to their rural base. But I apologize, I don't recall off the top of my head which denomination the Fergusons attended or belonged to.
No worries at all. And kind of another tangential question. You had mentioned that the Ferguson's policies really kind of appealed to rural Texas. What were some of those policies? What were they promising rural Texans that appealed to them?
Well, some of the things that they promised were things that were kind of standard things that you would promise, to get the big money power out of office and run with the people's interest in mind. The Fergusons also promised an old age pension, which did not come to fruition. One of the things the Fergusons became most known for during both of Ma's terms is that they were known for giving lots of pardons from prison sentences. And that this was a way that, at least according to the detractors of the Fergusons, that the Fergusons would use to kind of like get political capital. If you invest in my whatever, then I'll let your cousin out of jail. So the Fergusons kind of were known for these backdoor deals. But I think a lot of people who were a little bit less fortunate, economically speaking, liked that the Fergusons were kind of willing to be freewheeling with pardons. They saw this as the Fergusons looking out for the little guy. And the Fergusons were very willing to use kind of insider connections to promote their friends to new offices. And they did promise some kinds of rural reform, education for rural dwellers, those kinds of things. I can't remember how much of that actually came to fruition during Ma's term as governor. That was something Governor Ferguson tried to work on during his term in the 1910s. So those were some of the types of things that the Fergusons promoted.
And here's kind of an interesting question about Huey Long. So one of our attendees said, I read somewhere that Huey Long would brag that he would be reelected unless he was caught with a dead woman or a live boy. Do you know if that was true?
Do I know if it's true that he said that?
Yeah.
I'd have to Google that for you to be sure, but it wouldn't surprise me if Huey Long said something like that.
Yeah.
First of all, just knowing how some of these politicians in the 20s and 30s talked, I mean, I could imagine Governor Ferguson saying something that hyperbolic. Huey Long was known as kind of ruling the state of Louisiana as a dictator, a beloved dictator to most, because he promoted social welfare and reform in the state, but he did it in a very top-down style. So if you were on the wrong side of Huey Long, you could, suffer the consequences. If I remember correctly, Huey Long was eventually assassinated. So he was definitely a controversial figure. The Share Our Wealth program was something that he began promoting in the mid-30s as a critique of Roosevelt. He felt that FDR wasn't going far enough in terms of offering social support to the average American, and he wanted to see Roosevelt push an even more progressive agenda. Roosevelt was always trying to walk the line between the progressive forces in the Democratic Party, like Huey Long and others who wanted old age pensions and health care and, even share our wealth type of things from Huey Long, and those who were much more on the kind of conservative side of things that preferred a, states' rights approach. So that's a little bit about Huey Long.
Got it. We've got a couple of questions about the Texas Railroad Commission. Basically, how did it come into existence? And can you describe how it got its name? What does it regulate? Did it start out regulating only oil and gas? Just kind of a little bit of history there.
Yes. You are definitely asking me to remember some facts that are not all at the top of my brain anymore. Okay. This is going to be we all should Google this to make sure that I remembered it correctly afterwards, but I'll tell you what does come to mind. The Texas Railroad Commission was a project of the late 19th or early 20th century. I want to say it came into existence under Governor Hogg, but I think the second Hogg, not the first one. But I can't 100% be sure that I'm remembering that correctly. It did not regulate railroads for very long. It pretty quickly became the government entity to regulate oil and gas. The fact that it's called the Railroad Commission is definitely a misnomer in the present day, right? It doesn't have anything to do with railroads. Why it would have been used to regulate oil and gas in the first place, my understanding or assumption is that railroad commissions would have been concerned with public lands and how public lands were regulated or used for purposes of transportation. Texas oil law, and there's probably someone on this call who knows a lot more about this than I do, just based on who tends to be a Texas ex, right? It has to do with kind of flows of oil and topography and geology and all of these sorts of things. So I guess the Railroad Commission kind of became the place where that was regulated. I can't remember, again, specifically what decade that transition happened, but it did not actually regulate railroads for very long.
Right. And then we have another question. Could you expand on what business progressives stood for and what their aims for state government were?
So business progressive is a term that Dr. Brown uses in his first book as well as his second book, although I believe he adopted it from another scholar. And some of why this term exists is because historians are trying to understand there's this big national progressive movement. And for a long time, people said the South just didn't have progressivism. It just didn't exist in the South. And then people who studied Southern history said, no, that's not true. There were Southern politicians who were also interested in reform, but that they looked at it from kind of a pro-business stance. So progressives who were business progressives would have wanted to promote the types of social reforms that would have in some ways smoothed the way for business. So if we think about improved roads, this was one of the major progressive reforms that politicians in the state of Texas pursued for a lot of the 20th century. Texas did not have nearly the number of miles of paved or drivable roads in the first part of the 20th century as, northeastern states might have had. So better roads means better commerce, right? Better and improved education. Of course, this is something that most people would want anyway, so it's kind of a more education. You very rarely find people in that era would oppose that concept, but it's also one of those things that a more educated populace is better prepared for. We would say the workforce now. I wouldn't have said the workforce in the 1920s, but I can't remember. I can't think of the word they would have used, but better workers, right? Improved prisons and improved health services to a certain extent. Old age pensions, like these are all things that provide some level of support and safety for people in the state, but do not interfere with business in any way, right? There's no real regulation on business. So business progressives in the South would not have been interested in, wide scale social safety nets. They wouldn't have been interested in wide scale regulation of businesses. That being said, the state of Texas did, in its version of business progressivism, put a lot of protections on homegrown businesses and tried to prevent external businesses from coming into the state and preferred to promote business within the state. So trying to make sure that as many people within the state who wanted to do business could. So that's kind of a business progressive agenda versus, kind of a little bit more leftist kind of socialistic approach that others might have preferred, depending on what kind of progressive you were.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Did the leaders of the Texas Democratic Party support Hoover or Smith in 1928? Do you recall, or did they remain neutral?
Oh, it was a big fight. So let me see if I can get some names for you. So it was a huge split in the Democratic Party, and Democrats who tended to be dries, so they did not support, they wanted to continue Prohibition. They did not support the repeal of Prohibition. A lot of them defected and started working with Hoover Republicans in the state. Democrats who preferred a more wet, anti-Prohibition stance, were party loyalists and stayed and voted for Smith. So it was actually a big fight. And when Hoover was elected and it was time for these wings within the party to come back together and work together moving forward, there were even talks of party loyalty. There was discussion of passing a law that would prevent people from running for office as a Democrat or voting in a primary as a Democrat if they had not voted for the Democrat in the previous election. So it was not a neutral situation at all. It caused a lot of conflict in the state. And that's something Dr. Brown wrote about pretty extensively, especially in the first couple of chapters of Biscuits, the Dole and Nodding Donkeys.
Awesome. I think we're going to finish up with a couple of questions about the oil boom and industry. So the first to the last question is, what, if any, similarities do you see between the oil boom in the 30s and shale or tech booms in current times?
Some similarities.
Yeah.
I will just foreground my response by saying no one would call upon me as an expert on either the modern tech boom or the modern shale oil production boom. So I don't know that I have anything particularly insightful to offer. My apologies to the questioner, but I think it's one of those where we can see, again, this kind of tension between desires to regulate and desires not to regulate, not being conversant on maybe what the latest legal or legislative battle is over oil, but environmental regulation is perhaps more a concern now than it would have been 100 years ago. Although there were people concerned about environmental waste even in the 20s and 30s. But this kind of tension between this is making our state a lot of money and jobs, and yet also is causing harm and also isn't economically stable, right? That was one of the issues of the oil industry 100 years ago, and even today, right? These boom and bust cycles that kind of persist. So yeah, I would say there are some similarities. I'm less sure how to draw out a parallel between the tech boom and the oil boom of that era. Just those seem like fairly distinct industries to me. Although I'd certainly be welcome to hear more from the questioner if they had a thread of inquiry they wanted to pursue.
Well said. So we're going to end with one last one. Do you feel like the movies like There Will Be Blood and Oh Brother, Where Art Thou depict the oil scene and politics accurately for their time periods?
Okay,
I guess the
so
best question is, have you seen both of them first?
Yeah, like I saw There Will Be Blood once, whenever that came out. I want to say that was more than 10 years ago. And then Oh Brother, Where Art Thou is a favorite film of mine. Although, to be honest, I pay more attention to the literary allegories than the oil politics in particular. However, I would say that they have a Pappy O'Daniel in the film that's like loosely based on our Pappy O'Daniel in the state of Texas, and the fact that he travels with a band that sings or projects a song. The idea that someone's home could be overtaken for the oil industry, like that doesn't strike me as patently false. I don't remember enough about There Will Be Blood. I apologize. I remember the milkshake scene, and that's about it, which I like milkshakes, which was not the point of the scene, but yeah.
Yeah, and just to our viewers, there's a couple of posts in the QA about books that some of our viewers recommend, so check that out. And I just wanted to say thank you very much, Dr. Ozanne, for hosting our March Lunchtime Lecture. It's been wonderful learning about our state's history and the politics that influenced it throughout the early 30s, and we're so appreciative of your time that you spent with us today. And I also want to thank all of our viewers, to everyone that participated in today's lecture. We hope that you've enjoyed this year's events, and we look forward to gathering again next month. Dr. Lichtenstein's lecture titled Why Holocaust and Genocide Studies, A Historian's Perspective, will be hosted on Wednesday, April 28th. You can learn more and register online at texasexes.org/lunchtime lectures. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a wonderful week.